One joke pitch in a Hollywood conference room almost triggered a war between two nuclear powers. Seth Rogen's seemingly harmless idea to make Kim Jong-un the target of an assassination comedy didn't just anger a dictator, it unleashed one of the most damaging corporate cyberattacks of 2014 and pulled the President of the United States into a fight over a movie most people had never heard of.
North Korea says the United States is on the verge of committing an act of war and that its reckless, provocative insanity will be met with merciless retaliation from Pyongyang.
In the late 2000s, Seth Rogen and his creative partner Evan Goldberg were tossing around outrageous what-if scenarios. What if a journalist scored an interview with a notorious dictator and was asked by the CIA to assassinate him? It was the kind of darkly comic premise that makes for great satire. Screenwriter Dan Sterling took the idea and ran with it, penning a draft script in 2011 featuring a fictional dictator in a made-up country. Initially, no real nations or leaders were named. It was satire in the abstract. But as the project developed at Sony Pictures, the creative team felt something was missing. The fictional approach seemed too safe, too removed from reality. Then they had what seemed like a brilliant idea. Why not make the bad guy a real person? Rogen, Goldberg, Sterling, and the Sony team ended up changing the story to focus on North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. They thought it would make the comedy sharper and more timely. The Kim family, known for its over-the-top image and nuclear threats, seemed like an easy target to poke fun at. Rogen later said the film's concept arose from a discussion about how it might be possible for journalists with access to world leaders to carry out assassinations. The timing worked out perfectly too. Originally, the script's antagonist had been Kim Jong-il, North Korea's then leader. But in December 2011, Kim Jong-il died, and his little-known son Kim Jong-un inherited the regime. By the time Sony officially greenlit the interview in early 2013, Kim Jong-un was the film's satirical target. Production rolled ahead in the fall of 2013. The plot would see Rogen and James Franco's characters recruited by the CIA to kill the North Korean leader on air. It was edgy, no doubt, but the team figured audiences were used to outrageous humor. After all, back in 2004, Team America World Police made fun of North Korea's former leader by showing him as a singing puppet.
Why is everyone so fucking stupid? Why aren't more people intelligent like me?
And all North Korea really did in response was send out some angry press statements. But here's where a comedy became warfare. What the filmmakers perhaps underestimated was how personally Kim Jong-un and the regime around him would take this particular insult. In June 2014, as Sony prepared to market the interview, North Korea got wind of the film's premise. Their reaction was swift and explosive. An official trailer had been released online depicting the fictional assassination plot and poking fun at Kim's godlike image in North Korea. Pyongyang's response was immediate and hyperbolic. North Korea's foreign ministry issued a furious statement via state media KCNA, calling the act of making and screening such a movie that portrays an attack on our top leadership a most wanton act of terror and act of war, declaring it absolutely intolerable.
North Korea!
I've watched every episode of your show in preparation for this interview. I particularly enjoyed the Miley Cyrus Camel Toe episode.
Wow.
The regime warned that allowing the film's release would be considered a grave provocation, with an unnamed spokesperson vowing a resolute and merciless response if the US government did not ban the movie. To North Koreans who are raised to worship the Kim family almost like gods, the idea of killing Kim Jong-un was completely unthinkable and deeply offensive. The foreign ministry statement declared the film the most undisguised terrorism and a war action to deprive the people of the DPRK of their mental mainstay and bring down its social system. But this wasn't just typical North Korean bluster. Kim Jong-un was taking this personally. Over the summer of 2014, North Korea escalated its rhetorical campaign. In July, Pyongyang's UN ambassador Ja Song-nam sent a formal letter to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, complaining that the film sponsors terrorism and should be regarded as the most undisguised sponsoring of terrorism as well as an act of war. North Korea's KCNA news agency slammed the movie, calling it reckless US provocative insanity, and said the country's people and military were full of hatred and rage over the insult. In Hollywood, this fiery rhetoric was initially dismissed as business as usual for North Korea's propaganda machine. To industry observers, the dictator's anger even seemed like free publicity. Industry press quipped that the controversy was perfect publicity.
North Korea is it's like much other big bullies. They think they're big, they're not really that big, and they'll talk a big talk, but they won't really do anything because they know they'll get smacked down pretty bad.
For the film's full release, But behind the scenes, there was genuine concern. Some unverified reports suggest Sony Pictures executives were cautioned by US Department of Homeland Security that the interview could provoke retaliation, though Sony and DHS spokesmen later denied formal warnings were issued. While Hollywood laughed off the threats as free publicity, intelligence agencies were tracking something far more serious brewing in the digital shadows. North Korea's clout was not to be underestimated. The regime had a history of cyber mischief and real-world violence. Still, no one predicted the form or magnitude of what came next. On the morning of Monday, November 24, 2014, employees at Sony Pictures Entertainment walked into a digital nightmare. Across Sony's offices worldwide, workers logging onto their computers were met with an ominous image, a menacing red skull on their screens, accompanied by the message, "Hacked by #GOP," and a warning that this was just a beginning. In an instant, a major Hollywood studio had been sucker-punched by an unprecedented cyber assault. The attackers identified themselves as the Guardians of Peace, or GOP, a previously unknown entity. Over the next hours and days, it became clear this was no simple website defacement. The FBI later determined this was a catastrophic breach involving the deployment of destructive malware that disrupted the company's business operations. The hackers had infiltrated deep into Sony's network, stealing a vast trove of data and deploying destructive malware to cripple the company's systems. The malware wreaked havoc on Sony's infrastructure. It wiped hard drives, brought down servers, and rendered thousands of computers inoperable. But this was just the beginning. The hackers had a plan to slowly torture Sony into submission.
One of the worst corporate cyber attacks paralyzed Sony Pictures last November. It was traced to North Korea, an act of revenge for a movie that spoofed the dictator Kim Jong-un.
The practical fallout was immediate and debilitating. Employees found themselves sitting at their desks trying to do their job with a pen and paper, as a Sony source admitted the day after the attack. From Los Angeles to Sony's London office, staff were instructed to avoid Wi-Fi and company systems during recovery, as IT staff tried to purge malware and secure the network. Only a few isolated machines, such as offline video editing Macs, remained usable. An internal memo warned it could take up to 3 weeks to restore the network. "We are down, completely paralysed," one Sony insider said bluntly. Early media coverage relayed hacker claims that tens of terabytes were stolen, though authorities did not confirm the total amount of exfiltrated data.
We've got a Hollywood whodunit to tell you about tonight. The FBI has been looking into a major computer breach at Sony Pictures for the past 2 weeks.
While Sony struggled to function, the Guardians of Peace were just getting started. On November 25th, GOP sent a taunting message to Sony executives. "We've already warned you, and this is just a beginning. We continue till our request be met." The wording was broken English, but the threat was crystal clear. As later leaked documents revealed, days before the attack, GOP had quietly emailed Sony demanding monetary compensation to prevent great damage. Sony apparently didn't pay, and perhaps didn't take the pre-attack email seriously. Now the hackers had upped the ante dramatically. Within 48 hours of the breach, the first leaks of stolen data began hitting the internet. On November 26th, several pirated copies of unreleased Sony movies, including Fury starring Brad Pitt and a new Annie remake, appeared on illicit file-sharing networks. Over early December 2014, the Guardians of Peace began staging a slow, painful public execution of Sony's secrets. GOP's cache reportedly included personal information on tens of thousands of Sony employees and Hollywood talent, including the social security numbers of around 47,000 people, ranging from crew members to A-list actors like Sylvester Stallone. The pilfered Sony data released by GOP was staggering in scope. Digital copies of passports and visa records for movie stars such as Angelina Jolie and Cameron Diaz were dumped online. Over 700 internal documents containing passwords for Sony's systems and accounts were leaked. At least 179 whole Outlook email archives belonging to Sony executives and IT staff were exposed, revealing years of correspondence. Perhaps the most damaging were the email leaks. By mid-December, GOP had uploaded archives of Sony executives' emails to public sites, revealing unguarded, often unflattering conversations among Hollywood power players.
It is not getting any better for Sony Pictures. Today, hackers released another round of embarrassing emails that made communication that was supposed to be private very public. So how can a corporation like Sony recover?
Emails showed producers and execs insulting major stars, griping about famous directors, and making racially tinged jokes, including an exchange between Sony Pictures co-chair Amy Pascal and producer Scott Rudin joking about President Obama's movie preferences. The embarrassment was profound. Pascal, one of the most powerful women in the film industry, was compelled to issue a public apology for her remarks. A few months later, in February 2015, she would step down from her job, effectively a casualty of the hack's fallout. For the thousands of ordinary people working for Sony Pictures, the hack was deeply personal. Private information about their lives was scattered across the internet. Emails, salaries, home addresses, even medical records. One file dump included a spreadsheet of 6,800 Sony employees with personal details including birth dates and social security numbers. On December 5th, an email signed GOP landed in Sony staff inboxes, warning employees to disassociate from the company.
If you don't, not only you, but your family will be in danger.
The psychological stress on employees was intense. Staff described working under surreal conditions, forbidden from using email or the internet, needing clearance to even turn on a computer. Some communications had to be done via fax machine, a technology nearly obsolete but dusted off as one of the few uncompromised channels. Sony's then CEO Michael Linton wrote to staff,
"This was an unparalleled and well-planned crime, carried out by an organised group for which neither SPE nor other companies could have been fully prepared."
By one estimate, repairs and restoration cost $35 million in the short term. Sony later settled lawsuits with employees whose data was exposed, agreeing to pay up to $8 million to cover damages like identity theft protection. But the hackers had been holding back their real demand, and it was about to become crystal clear. As Sony picked up the pieces internally, outside experts and US officials were racing to answer a critical question. Who exactly was behind this attack? From the start, suspicion fell on North Korea. The timing and content were conspicuous. An attack on the studio releasing The Interview just weeks before its scheduled debut after North Korea had loudly threatened to retaliate. On December 8, 2014, about 2 weeks into the hack, the Guardians of Peace went public with a clear ultimatum.
Stop immediately showing the movie of terrorism, which can break the regional peace and cause the war.
This was the first explicit acknowledgement that The Interview was at the center of their motivations. The GOP message called the film the movie of terrorism.
One of the worst corporate cyber attacks paralyzed Sony Pictures last November. It was traced to North Korea, an act of revenge for a movie that spoofed the dictator Kim Jong-un,
suggesting this comedy could ignite war. As later leaked documents revealed, days before the attack, GOP had quietly emailed Sony on November 21st, demanding monetary compensation
to prevent great damage.
The FBI was already connecting digital fingerprints to a familiar adversary. The FBI had found technical clues tying the Sony malware to North Korean-affiliated hackers, such as similarities to viruses used in attacks on South Korean banks. With this letter, any remaining doubts about a North Korean link grew fainter. The hackers were essentially echoing Pyongyang's own rhetoric about the film. After all, North Korea's UN envoy had called the movie
sponsoring terrorism and an act of war as well.
US investigators would soon formally conclude North Korea's government was responsible, with the FBI stating,
"As a result of our investigation and in consultation with other US government departments and agencies, the FBI now has enough information to conclude that the North Korean government is responsible for these actions."
Meanwhile, North Korea officially denied involvement, though a government spokesman said the Sony hack might be a righteous deed of the supporters and sympathizers of North Korea. Then, on December 16th, the Guardians of Peace turned their threats toward the general public. In a message deliberately timed just ahead of The Interview's planned premiere, the hackers issued a chilling warning to any moviegoers intending to see the film. Referencing the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks, GOP wrote,
"We will clearly show it to you at the very time and places the interview will be shown, including the premiere, how bitter fate those who seek fun in terror should be doomed to."
Get this now, the Sony hackers threatening violence in America. The New York premiere of this movie called The Interview has been canceled after hackers warned of a 9/11-style terror attack at theaters showing that film.
Urging people to avoid crowds at theaters and ominously adding,
"Remember the 11th of September 2001.
Never before had anonymous hackers threatened movie theaters. Sony faced an impossible choice: cave to terrorism or risk American lives over a comedy. This was an unprecedented moment. Anonymous hackers invoking 9/11 and suggesting they would attack cinemas showing a film. For the first time in Hollywood history, a terrorist threat was made against movie theaters over a forthcoming release. The 9/11 reference proved to be the tipping point. On December 16th, within hours of the hackers issuing their chilling threat against theaters, the largest movie theater chains in North America began pulling out: Regal Cinemas, AMC, Cinemark, Carmike. One by one announced they would not screen The Interview as planned. They cited safety concerns for audiences and staff. With the big players out, Sony faced a distribution collapse. The company sent a message to theater owners, saying it understood if they chose not to play the film given the circumstances. But Sony's surrender was about to trigger an even bigger fight. On December 17th, Sony Pictures pulled the plug, announcing it was cancelling the December 25th theatrical release of the interview entirely. It was a stunning retreat. Never before had a major Hollywood film been shelved on the eve of release due to a direct threat. Sony's statement indicated it had
no further release plans for the interview.
The decision drew intense criticism from many corners, including Hollywood A-listers.
Now, the sinister turn in the Sony Pictures hack attack has prompted the cancellation of the New York premiere of the forthcoming comedy film The Interview.
From North Korea's perspective, the cancellation was hailed as a major victory. A North Korean National Defense Commission spokesman celebrated the film's shelving, though bizarrely accused President Obama of personally orchestrating the release and resorted to a racist diatribe, calling Obama
a monkey in a tropical forest.
As the dust settled, GOP sent one more message to Sony executives, this time congratulating them.
Very wise to cancel the interview. It will be very useful for you.
Then the most powerful person in America decided to weigh in. On December 19th, 2014, President Barack Obama held a year-end press conference and publicly criticized Sony's decision to cancel the film's release.
I think they made a mistake.
Obama's remarks were a ringing defense of free expression. He emphasized that we cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States. Obama warned that allowing intimidation to quash a satirical movie could snowball.
If somebody's able to intimidate folks out of releasing a satirical movie, imagine what they start doing when they see a documentary they don't like or news reports that they don't like. That's not who we are. That's not what America is about,
the president declared emphatically. Obama went further, revealing he wished Sony had consulted with the government before making their decision. This was remarkable, effectively the commander-in-chief saying a movie studio should have coordinated with the White House on how to handle a film release threat. By December 19th, the FBI had officially announced that North Korea was behind the Sony cyber attack, citing technical evidence linking the malware to North Korean operatives. The White House labeled the hack a serious national security matter. Obama vowed that the United States would respond proportionally to the cyber assault on Sony.
We will respond in a place and time we choose.
Sony CEO Michael Linton responded in an interview that they had been in touch with a senior White House advisor throughout the episode, and that the decision to cancel was driven by theatre closures more than pure capitulation.
We have not backed out,
Linton insisted on CNN. We still want the American public to see it. The president had thrown down the gauntlet, but would anyone step up? In early January 2015, President Obama signed an executive order imposing new sanctions on North Korea, specifically as retaliation for the Sony hack. The sanctions targeted North Korean agencies and officials tied to the country's arms trade and cyber activities, including its primary intelligence organization. This was the first time the US had sanctioned a country in direct response to a cyber attack on an American company. Within days, an unprecedented plan was taking shape, one that would turn digital warfare on its head. On December 23rd, just 6 days after Sony had said it had no further release plans, the studio announced that the interview would indeed be shown to the public after all. Under mounting pressure, Sony arranged a limited theatrical release through independent and small theatre chains, coupled with an unprecedented, simultaneous online release. Sony reached out to independent cinemas, the kind of quirky local theatres that often show indie films or cult classics. These theatres, unlike the big chains, were eager to thumb their nose at the threats and show support for artistic freedom. By Christmas, more than 300 theatres across the United States, plus a handful in Canada, had signed up to play the film. Marquees proudly displayed the film's title. Many theatres reported that the interview sold out every show on Christmas.
This because you two lucky gentlemen are going to be in a room alone with him. Congratulations, by the way.
That's right.
Which is part of the reason why we're here.
With audiences often cheering and applauding during screenings. It became more than a movie. It was a modest act of defiance. Independent theatres like the Plaza Atlanta tweeted their support for showing the film as an act of free expression. The numbers were about to prove something extraordinary. Even more significantly, on December 24th, Sony made the interview available online, making it one of the first major studio films ever to debut on the internet at the same time as its theatrical release. The studio struck quick deals with Google and Microsoft. Starting Christmas Eve morning, viewers could rent or buy the interview on Google Play, YouTube Movies, or Xbox Video with a few clicks. The price was $5.99 to rent, or $14.99 to purchase a stream. Sony's Michael Linton said, "We chose the path of digital distribution first so as to reach as many people as possible on opening day." He added,
"While we couldn't have predicted the road this movie travelled to get here, I'm proud our fight was not for nothing and that cyber criminals were not able to silence us."
Google's chief legal officer David Drummond wrote a blog post about their decision to offer the film, saying Google did not want to sit on the sidelines guidelines and allow a handful of people to determine the limits of free speech in another country, however silly the content might be. The results were stunning and validated a fundamental truth about censorship. By December 29th, just 4 days into release, Sony reported that the interview had been rented or purchased online over 2 million times, generating around $15 million in revenue on digital platforms and another $2.8 million from the small theater screenings.
The Interview is one of the most talked about movies in America. Many fans say that seeing the comedy is a civic duty and a statement to alleged North Korean hackers who tried to block it.
That made The Interview the #1 online film of 2014 in terms of sales on platforms like Google Play and YouTube Movies, according to Google. Never before had a film achieved such digital success so quickly. By the end of its first week, The Interview's online revenue climbed to $31 million. Eventually, the film's total digital haul reached about $40 million, making it Sony's most successful digital release ever. Here we can see the Streisand effect was in full display. Attempted censorship had created the very attention it tried to prevent. The movie that was supposed to disappear had become impossible to ignore. The Interview probably got far more viewers than it ever would have without the controversy. People who might have skipped a dumbstoner comedy were now watching it out of a sense of civic duty or pure curiosity. The hackers' attempt to scare people away had instead galvanized them. The threats had proven empty. There were no attempts to bomb theaters or harm viewers. People showed up and laughed at the absurdity of the movie.
Diane, we just saw a crowd walk out of the front doors here at Cinema Village. About 100 or so people just got done watching the theater's first screening of The Interview, and a lot of them telling us they showed up here this morning because of all the controversy.
And that was that. GOP's power to instill fear was effective only so long as people believed the threats were credible. What began as a stoner comedy ended as a global incident that left ripples in diplomacy, cybersecurity, and entertainment. The Sony hack is widely regarded as one of the most damaging corporate cyberattacks in history. In September 2018, the US Department of Justice indicted a North Korean programmer named Park Jin-hyuk on charges related to the Sony hack and other high-profile cybercrimes like the 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack. The incident sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Studios tightened network security, invested in better encryption, and limited how long they keep sensitive emails. There's anecdotal evidence that executives became more cautious about what they put in writing, knowing those frank opinions could one day leak. In the immediate aftermath, Paramount Pictures cancelled planned screenings of their movie,
Team America, World Police,
at some theatres that wanted to show it as a substitute for The Interview. This showed studios were initially spooked about antagonising North Korea or other hostile actors. For corporations beyond entertainment, the Sony hack became a case study in cyber vulnerability. It demonstrated the destructive potential of nation-state-backed hackers attacking a private company, stealing trade secrets, erasing data, and coercing behaviour.
This is America we live in, not North Korea. They can dictate and abuse their people all they want, but they're not going to do that to us here.
The Interview saga was a milestone in the intersection of entertainment and geopolitics. It raised novel questions. Can a comedy be a national security issue? Do foreign governments have a veto on American art? How should companies deal with terrorist-like demands? It also previewed the kind of cyber confrontations that have since become more common, using hacked information for coercion and propaganda in the internet age. One lesson is that censorship can backfire spectacularly. North Korea's efforts to stop The Interview inadvertently ensured millions more people saw it. As one industry outlet observed,
as the film shot to the top of the online charts, never before has a film had the sort of media attention in the run-up to its release as The Interview.
By attempting to quash the movie, the hackers turned it into a must-see cultural phenomenon. Another lesson: Hollywood and the creative community, when pushed, will rally to defend free expression. The initial response was caution and fear, but once Sony regained footing, community support and public sentiment clearly favoured not letting censors win. Today, The Interview can be watched on streaming platforms much like any other film. Its once notorious status largely faded. Kim Jong-un remains firmly in power in North Korea, likely still enraged at the thought of a Hollywood farce depicting his demise. Perhaps the ultimate irony is that The Interview delivered a kind of poetic justice through comedy. In the film's final scene, the character of Kim Jong-un meets a fiery, explosive end to the tune of a Katy Perry power ballad, a ridiculous, over-the-top send-off. In reality, Kim Jong-un was alive and well, angrily ordering missile tests and censorship at home. But for one moment in cinema, the dictator's aura of invincibility was pierced by laughter and mockery. That is what he feared most. And that is why the regime reacted with such fury. In that sense, The Interview did what satire is meant to do: speak truth to power, even through juvenile humour, and remind us that no one, not even a dictator, is above being laughed at. The saga around the film's release reminded the world that defending the right to laugh, even at great risk, is a fight worth having. Kim Jong-un's greatest fear, being laughed at, became reality on a scale he could never have imagined. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. Please do consider subscribing to the channel if you found value in this. Oh, and YouTube thinks you will like this video. Do watch it before you leave.